At exactly 4 a.m., the kettle on Mildred Henley's borrowed hot plate began to whistle soft, almost apologetic, while she stood barefoot on the frost-bitten porch of the Pine Haven Volunteer Fire Hall, clutching a cracked coffee mug someone had pressed into her hands 12 hours earlier. Steam curled up like a question she couldn't answer. From the parking lot, she could still smell wet cedar from last night's storm mixed with the sour bite of smoke that refused to leave her coat. Somewhere behind her, Deputy Cal's old radio crackled with static. "North wind picking up. Mail truck'll be early today." Mildred lifted the mug lip trembling not from cold and stared past the flagpole toward the far end of Spruce Street, where the only thing left of the little blue house she'd called home for 43 years was the outline of its stone chimney, black against the lavender sky. The kettle screamed louder 30 seconds now before it boiled itself dry. She opened her mouth, maybe to pray, maybe to curse, but only a small, bewildered laugh slipped out, the kind that breaks during heartbreak without permission. Then her knees folded, and the mug slipped slow toward the painted concrete where it would surely shatter. But a wool-mittened hand caught it mid-air. "Easy, Millie," whispered Ruth Jensen, owner of the Pinecone Cafe, the only diner bold enough to serve lingonberry pancakes every Tuesday, even when snow piled 3 feet high. Ruth's mitt was singed at the thumb. She'd stood beside Mildred until the last ember died. Behind Ruth, the double doors of the fire hall opened and closed like gentle lungs. Whoosh, clunk, whoosh, clunk, each exhale releasing the scent of strong coffee and cinnamon rolls. Inside, townsfolk moved in quiet choreography, folding blankets, stacking canned peaches, writing names on masking tape labels, while outside, the first snowflake of the morning landed on Mildred's cheek like a kiss she didn't expect. If this touched you already, subscribe to The Kind Story, tap like, and share it with someone who needs this moment. Mildred Henley had moved to Pine Haven, Minnesota, the spring she turned 21, fresh out of teacher's college, pockets holding $2 silver and a recipe for lemon bars from her mother. She taught second grade for 3 decades, chalk dust in her curls, playground songs in her heart. At retirement, she stayed for the loons on Stillwater Lake, and the way the town band played Moonlight Serenade every 4th of July from the gazebo that leaned like an old man tipping his hat. She filled her house with quilts, teacups, and a rescue cat named Thimble, who slept on the windowsill above the radiator that pinged like distant Morse code. Thursday nights, she volunteered at the library, stamping due dates with a satisfying clack-clack that made children giggle. All of that, every ribbon, every memory, had been swallowed by fire before the sirens even reached the corner of Spruce and Twand. The cause, they said later, had been a faulty wire in the attic fan. A single spark. By the time Mildred smelled smoke, orange tongues were already licking the wallpaper her late husband, Frank, had helped her hang one stubborn Saturday long ago. She escaped with Thimble in her arms and the nightgown on her back. That was all. In the first hours, shock wrapped her like gauze thick, muffling everything except the rhythmic drip of melted snow from the fire hoses. Neighbors she'd only waved to across fences arrived in droves. Pastor Louise brought a folding cot. Teenager Ellie Gunderson, who once got detention for carving "I love algebra" into her desk, handed Mildred a brand new toothbrush still in its plastic shell. Old Mr. Halverson offered the spare room above his hardware store, smelling perpetually of cedar shavings and turpentine. And Ruth, practical Ruth, started a list on a yellow legal pad labeled simply Millie Needs. Number 1. Time to breathe. 2 days later, the town council held an emergency meeting in the library basement. Folding chairs squeaked, the radiator hissed winter back at them. Mayor Donna, who ran the flower shop and could quote seed catalogs like scripture, cleared her throat. "Pine Haven takes care of its own," she declared. By unanimous vote, they created the Phoenix Fund, a mason jar with a slit in the lid painted sunrise orange placed beside the diner's cash register. Every coin clink felt like a heartbeat added back to Mildred's chest. But money was only the first layer of small-town kindness. On the third morning, Mildred woke on Mr. Halverson's lumpy sofa to the sound of hammers. She padded to the window. Across the street, a dozen volunteers, some she'd once taught, some she hadn't, were already shoveling blackened beams into neat piles. The air smelled of pine, sawdust, and possibility. Deputy Cal had tied a bright red bandana around his bulldog neck for visibility. Every time he bent to lift, the bandana flapped like a tiny flag of stubborn hope. Ruth appeared beside her holding 2 steaming cups. "Thought you'd like cocoa with the little marshmallows like we served at the fall festival when you ran the ring toss." Mildred took the cup. The warmth stung her cold palms. "Ruth," she whispered, voice cracking, "I don't know how to start over." Ruth sipped thoughtfully. "One nail at a time, Millie. Same way we built the float for the centennial, remember?" Mildred almost smiled. The centennial float had lost a wheel halfway down Main Street and still won Most Spirited. That afternoon, the insurance adjuster delivered news that threatened to flatten her again. The policy she and Frank had purchased in 1992 carried a clause she'd forgotten coverage capped at half the rebuilding cost. Panic fluttered like trapped birds. But before the fear could roost, a gentle twist arrived. Ellie's tech-savvy older brother, Mason, created an online fundraiser titled Mrs. Henley's Blue House Rises. Within 48 hours, it had raised not just the gap, but enough extra for a front porch swing and a ramp for when her knees grew older. Donations poured in from former students, now scattered from Seattle to Sarasota, each note signed with the same closing. "You taught us subtraction, but you never subtracted love." The kindness of strangers, once a phrase in a book, became bricks in her hands. What would you do in their place if the jar on the counter were for you? Drop a thought, or even a single emoji below. 6 months later, the lilacs along Spruce Street were just beginning to bud when the rebuilt house blew again but brighter, like a robin's egg polished by spring stood finished. The town threw a welcome home picnic on the lawn. Red and white checkered cloths fluttered over borrowed banquet tables. Someone brought a kazoo band. Someone else brought thimble, a new collar stitched with tiny bells. Mildred walked up the fresh-painted steps, heart thudding louder than the kazoos. She paused at the threshold, hand on the doorknob that still smelled faintly of varnish. Inside, the entryway smelled of pine and lemon oil. Ruth had polished every surface until it glowed. On the newel post hung a small wooden sign burned with the words, "Because we rise together." She moved from room to room, fingertips grazing smooth drywall, noting the careful placement of electrical sockets. Higher now, safer. And the quilt on the sofa, stitched from squares, donated by every family in town, each square embroidered with a date. The year their child had been in her class. In the kitchen, the old radiator had been replaced by a quiet, efficient unit, but someone had saved the original brass knob and mounted it like a tiny sculpture on the windowsill above the sink. She turned it gently. It still pinged. From the living room came the soft creak of the new porch swing where Thimble was already curled, purring in a bar of sunlight. That evening, after the last deviled egg had been eaten and the last story told, Mildred stood alone on her porch. The air smelled of lilac and charcoal from the grill. Somewhere down the block, the town clock struck 9 slow, deliberate chimes that felt like blessings. She closed her eyes and listened. The squeak of the swing chain, the distant murmur of neighbors saying goodnight, the soft clink-clink of Mason collecting empty lemonade jars. She thought of the fire, of the night she believed her world had ended in sparks and sirens. Instead, it had ended in hands hundreds of them lifting her up. She stepped back inside, opened the small cedar box Ruth had given her, and took out the 2 silver dollars she'd carried to Pine Haven all those years ago. She set them on the mantel beneath a quilted square marked 1978, the year she'd taught her very first class. Then she turned off the lights, sat on the swing, and let the stars press down like quiet applause. If your heart feels full right now, subscribe to The Kind Story, tap like, and share it with someone who needs this feel-good moment. And now, one last time, what would you do if love showed up at your door disguised as a cracked coffee mug, a singed mitten, or a mason jar painted sunrise orange? Tell us below. Now, tell us your kind story in the comments. Your words might become our next episode.